Hey there, welcome back to Coding at Home with the Code Hub. Hey again, I'm Matt from the Code Hub. Just a quick reminder, if you're trying to join the live session and maybe this is your first time coding or you've not been with us before or you need a refresher before we dive into the heavy stuff, it's not too heavy. We always have our videos posted to YouTube. We have a couple of playlists. We have a kids.code playlist that will have everything that we've done so far up to day 35 or whatever day this is. We also have two other playlists. One for the Lights Camera Code playgrounds. They are start out at a pretty beginner level. It really helps to have had the Everyone Can Code Puzzles experience, just so that you know a bit about Swift fundamentals. But it's worth following through those playgrounds and just watching along with the videos and the playlists. So if you're joining the live session and you're desperate to get in on the action, watch through some of the YouTube videos and you'll be able to catch up with us in no time. Alternatively, you can join us on our Friday sessions. We have the info for our look back sessions there. Um, Go register. We'll send you the details for the Zoom chat that we hold every Friday. And we'll be going through the Hello Byte Playground, which is a very entry level kind of hour of code style playground. But we're going through it very slowly so that you understand the coding concepts that we're talking about. So with that out of the way, we're going to jump back into our Assemble Your Camera playground, which I was talking with the guys yesterday. This is a perfect playground for building your Swift Student Challenge application for WWDC 2020. It gives you an app that you can add your components to. It gives you a space you can draw into. It gives us buttons that we're going to hook up today. A lot of interesting stuff in this playground for you to play around with, and would be a great entry for the Swift Student Challenge. Now you only have until Sunday, so you don't have a lot of time, but maybe take a look and give it a shot. All right, let's go over to the iPad. All right, so where we left off yesterday was styling our components. I have added all of this stuff here. We've added background colors. We've tweaked the size and the position of where we're putting things. We've tweaked the style on our different components, like our camera view, our zoom slider. We rotated the zoom slider 90 degrees. We picked a shutter button image and a front back button image that hopefully will kind of match the aesthetic of our application. We've changed the minimum and maximum track colors for the zoom slider. We've hooked up the camera view so that it starts. We've done a lot. And we've even connected the shutter button here to the camera view dot trigger. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. So if I run my code, this is what it looks like. Okay, you remember I added a mask image to my camera view that was that bear shape. So that's why I've got kind of a funky bear shape camera camera view. I'm actually going to take out my overlay view just by commenting it out. This is kind of a handy way to write your code. If you comment things out, you might want to come back to it later and add it back in. I'm just commenting it back out because I do feel like later tonight I'll go back and add an overlay image to really get the look of my camera down. But that's it. We've gone through all of the instructions here: position and size, styling the viewfinder, styling the buttons, styling the zoom slider. We answered our quiz question right, hopefully. So now we're going to go on to setting up the button for switching between the back and front cameras. So let's hit next. Again, like before, all my code in the My Camera file has carried over. So all of my connections to the shutter button, my commented out camera view overlay image. And you can see even when we commented out, this is a little bit of the magic that Swift Playgrounds handles for us. When we comment these kind of cool things out that have like a color swatch or an image, we see that they've got some syntax of their own where they pull in images. We won't go into that too much, but it's just kind of interesting that there's more going on underneath the hood than we necessarily see. All right, so now we're going to talk about the front back button. Because so far we've only hooked up the back button, so we can't do our selfies unless we're very good with aiming the back camera at our face. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a function called switch camera to switch the camera view between the front and back cameras. This function is going to handle a pressed event when you press the button to switch between the front and back cameras. Now we've handled a pressed event here with our shutter button, right? We hooked up the press property and we connected it to this camera view.trigger. So let's follow the instructions here and open my camera file. We're going to find the following comment, front back function. Here we go, it's down here. We're going to write a function called switch camera, and it's going to take a parameter called a pulse. That's a type that gets sent to us from the button. So let's add that. Let's start typing in func. And there's my func autocomplete. So let's hit func autocomplete. I really like using the func autocomplete because then it gives me all the other window dressing around my function. So it gives me the parentheses, the braces, and even the placeholder for a function body. So we're going to call this thing switch camera. We're going to add a parameter to this function. So if we just tap in there, we're going to get it, I swear. So I tapped on the brace at the end and I got this menu up. So I'm going to type add, I'm going to hit add parameter. We're going to call it pulse. And the type is type pulse. Now, if that didn't work for you, if you tapped on the end and this menu didn't come up, you can always tap on the end, tap and hold the space bar and then drag it into the parentheses and then type this stuff out yourself. Again, I like using that autocomplete function because it kind of does the right thing for you. And then let's see, what's our function going to do? They've got the code written here. So it's saying camera view dot, there's a property on it called is using front camera. And what we're going to do is we're going to assign that a value. So we're going to assign it a value to not camera view is using front camera. What on earth is that doing? Well, okay, if we left it like this, if we left this code like this, my red dot went away, so I've got no errors. It doesn't match this because I haven't got the not operator. And you might remember that from Everyone Can Code Puzzles. If I did this, all I'm doing is I'm assigning the value of camera view dot is using front camera to the property of camera view is using front camera. So I'm assigning it to the same thing. So if I'm using the front camera, that's going to be true. And I'm assigning it to the same thing. So I'm not really doing anything. If I add the not in here, so the exclamation point, now what I'm doing is saying, hey, whatever value is in here is in using front camera. So if it's true, because I am using the front camera, add the opposite. Set the property to the opposite of it. So now it's going to switch it to false. So there's a couple notes here. And in fact, it explains the exclamation point here. If we say, what does the not mean? It swaps the Boolean value. So if the property was true, it sets it to false and vice versa. So this is another way of writing that code that we wrote up here. Now this is very succinct. It's very short, very to the point. If you're an experienced programmer, this makes a ton of sense to you and you go, oh, yep, I'm just flipping the value and assigning the flipped value to that same property. But maybe this makes more sense to you. And sometimes this does. I prefer this where we're a little bit more verbose, where we say, well, if we're using the front camera, we're going to set is using the front camera to false because we want to switch it. We want to switch from front to back. And then otherwise, we want to set the is using front camera to true because we can assume that is using front camera here was false. So this is another way to write it that's not wrong. It's just a little bit more verbose. But sometimes you want that because it's a little bit more clear. So if someone else comes to read your code and maybe they're not expert programmers yet, this might help them understand it a little bit better. So that's what the not operator does. And then we have an explanation about what does pulse mean. So pulse is the type of event that's sent when you press a button. So this function here is going to receive this pulse event from the button type. And what we'll do is we'll try to develop a little bit of an aid for you to remember and to understand how events are sent, especially when we start doing this graphical programming here. It's not always going to be the same for all graphical interfaces. Programming for Windows or Android or the Mac might be different than programming for this camera playground or programming an iOS application. But a lot of the concepts are similar, so they'll translate well. All right, so we have our function written. We could run this code and try tapping the front back button over here. Well, it's not working. I can just see my mug. That's it. Shutter button's still hooked up, so that's good. All right, so I need to do something else to get this actually hooked up, as you might have guessed. Now we need to connect the component. So here's the shutter button here. And then here is our function. So we want to connect the pressed output, that pressed property on our button, our front back button, to the switch camera function. So the way we do that is in this connect the components comment, and you remember this is way back in our initializer where we connected our shutter button. Underneath that, I'm going to hit the return key down here. Now I'm going to connect the front back button. So I'm going to start typing in front back button dot. Let's see, just make sure I've named it right. Front back button, and we're going to do dot pressed. And then we're going to connect it. Dot connect. I'm going to use the open parentheses. For some reason my autocomplete isn't working. And we have a to parameter, so to with a colon. Switch camera. Okay. My red dot went away because you might have seen that the red dot showed up a couple of times as I was typing, because Swift was trying to take a look at the code that it saw on the screen and said, I don't know what to do with this. So I'll just show the red dot just in case to let you know that code isn't going to work for me. So what we've done is this front back button, they have a property called pressed that's going to send out that pulse event to whatever it's connected to. And in this case, instead of being a variable, normally we've seen parameters that are variables and properties that we use. In fact, you might have guessed that, oh, the camera view.trigger, surely that's got to be a property. We can also in Swift pass around functions. So this switch camera refers to this switch camera function. So if I rename this switch camera to something else, like really switch camera, I'm going to have an issue with my code. So if I go back up here, my red dots come back, and if I tap on this red dot over here, it's going to say use of unresolved identifier switch camera. So you can see that it was, because I just changed the function name, it's now having an issue because it doesn't know anything about switch camera. So this is where it's resolving which basically means kind of looking up through the code and saying, oh yeah, I do have a variable or a function called that. It's resolving that back to my function here called switch camera. So now that we've connected the components here with our front back button pressed connect to switch camera, let's try running it. So now if I've got my back camera there, and now I've got my front camera. So I'm able to switch, and that function is being called, and I'm swapping out the two. All right, not bad, not bad. So pretty good. So what that means is that this is a great way for us to start hooking up buttons to call our own code. Before, we were calling the CameraView.trigger code, that function inside CameraView.trigger. Now we're actually able to say, hey, I want to connect these buttons to code that I've written so I can do interesting things with them, like swap that is using front camera on my camera view. But while we're in this function, we could have done more. We could have written more code in here to do other things. Maybe change the icon here from arrows to, different colored arrows to show that you're on the front camera. Now this is really interesting, especially in the view of the student challenge. You can write buttons and you can hook them up to your own code and have them run code inside your functions. Maybe you add another camera view when you press a button, or you add another button to the screen when you press a button. There's a lot you can start to do with this. Okay, so we have our front back button hooked up. Is it working? We press the button and it switches between the front and back cameras. We're looking good. So quick quiz. What does this code do here? Front back button dot pressed dot connect to switch camera. Does it, the switch camera function presses the button for switching between the front and back cameras? Does it cause the switch camera function to take a photo when you press the shutter button? Or does pressing the camera's front back button call the switch camera function? Which do you think it is? Shout it out again. Hopefully I'll hear it. All right, if you shout it out pressing the camera's front back button, you were right. So the switch camera function itself doesn't press the button between switching the front and back cameras. It just tells the camera view, hey, you should be using the front facing camera, or you should be facing the back facing camera, depending what state you were in just before. Excellent. That's a huge bit of work, because that means a lot. The implications of this, being able to hook up our buttons inside these assemble your camera playgrounds, is huge, because now you can make buttons that will do all sorts of things. We don't have to limit ourselves to just a front back button and a shutter button, because you can see we don't have types that are specifically a shutter button or a front back button. They're actually just these generic button types. So we could put them all over the screen, and we can give them different images and make them do different things. So if you do have an idea for the Swift Student Challenge, I would go and, sketch out your app, put as many buttons as you want, maybe add a few drawings like this, where you illustrate what's going to happen when you tap on that button and how it affects other elements on your screen. This is really big stuff. All right, so let's go off, and we have another component on the screen. We have our zoom slider. Now, if you haven't added one to your screen, you can move on to the app class without me, or you can add a zoom slider. I think the zoom slider is kind of interesting, because now you can control what shows up in the camera view and how close in you zoom in and out with the camera, the back camera anyway. Because it does note that you can't zoom in and out using the front camera. All right. So what we're going to do now, this is a slightly different way of hooking up this element. So the buttons, they have this press event press property that we can connect to our code. Now we're going to write this thing called an event handler function. So this code is going to be code that we write that'll sit there, and when it gets a notification from the slider that it's moved, we're going to get a message saying, hey, this is the new value of the zoom slider. And if we tap on the blue here, it just mentions what an event handler is. It's basically just a function that happens to be called after an event happens with a reference to the event, so you can handle it. And here it mentions that every time we move the zoom slider left or right, or up or down in our case, an event sends a value between negative 0.5 and 0.5. And we can access the slider's value changed output. All right, so what we're going to do is this is the function we're going to write, and here's the spot for it. So we're going to start out by typing in func and autocomplete. And we're going to call it on slider value changed. Because this name makes it very easy for us to guess what it is, why we're getting this function called. I'm going to add a property to a parameter to my method here. So I'm going to tap and hold and drag it over. And I'm going to call the parameter value with a colon. And it's going to be of type double. If you remember, a double is just a decimal number. So it's got a decimal point in there, like negative 0.5 or positive 0.5. So in my body of my function, I'm going to write this. I'm going to use the zoom property on the camera view. Camera view.zoom. And we're going to assign it this value. So we're going to assign it the value plus 0.5. Equals for assign. Value is going to be, we'll use the plus operator, and we'll do 0.5. Now, can you guess what that's going to do? Can you imagine what that's going to do? If we're going to get messages sent to us where this value that changed is between negative 0.5 and 0.5, you can kind of see what's going to happen here. All right? Minus 0.5 plus 0.5 is going to be equal to what? 0, right? They're going to cancel each other out. And then if we add 0.5 to 0.5, we're going to get 1. So that's going to change the value of this camera view.zoom to be 1 if we get a 0.5 in there. So this is kind of interesting because we're using a little bit of math. We have to kind of imagine what's being sent in, all the different values that are being sent in. This is one way of doing it. We could have done it a different way. And if we run our code, we're not going to see anything super interesting because, can you guess why? It's not zooming in. That's just my hand moving. It's not showing us anything yet because I haven't hooked it up. I haven't told any of our code to call this on slider value changed function yet. So just like we try to imagine, so if we pass in a value of negative 0.5 to the function above, what will camera view's zoom value be? So the way I would read that through is I'd say, okay, cool. Well, so this value is equal to negative 0.5. The value here will be negative 0.5. Add it to 0.5. So what? We'll get 0. So well done. All right, so that's it. So if we tried another answer, we might have gotten another message. But let's configure it now so that it'll zoom out, in and out once when we use the slider. So now we're going to go again and we're going to connect the component. So just like we connected our button, this mentions the fact that that's the slider. The zoom slider's value changed output connects to the on slider value change function. That may sound like Greek, but we're going to see how to write that code in just a second. So this is how we connect the components. And remember, we're connecting the components off in the initializer. So after I've configured my front back button, I'm going to add this zoom slider value change property. I'm going to connect it to this on slider value changed. So let's do that now. So zoom slider on slider dot, or sorry, zoom slider dot value changed dot connect, just like we've connected the other components we've seen already. The to parameter is going to be my on slider value changed function. Now, because I'm passing this as a parameter, I'm not including the parentheses. You may have said, well, wait a second, my on slider value changed has parentheses and it has these parameters. What happens to there? The way this parameter works is that it understands, it does a lookup and figures out that, oh, you know what, I know that I need to send a parameter to this on slider value changed function. I don't need the parameters here. All right, so let's try. Let's see. Is it working? Let's try it out. I'm going to run our code. There's the mug. And if I drag my finger really slow, I can see that it's not just at the top and at the bottom that I'm getting this value changed message. I'm actually getting it throughout as I drag up and down. And that's not my hand, I swear, zooming in and out on the mug. That's it. Now we have a fully functional zoom function. And if I flip the camera around, we'll see that I may still be sending the values, but the camera view isn't doing anything with my zoom slider events. So it's only the back camera that it's sending those events, just because this iPad's front camera doesn't support that. All right, so that worked. Excellent. So now that we've got a fully functioning camera, we've completed the whole of the point of this playground. What we're going to do next is we're going to actually look through a few different ways of using this particular code that we've written. Because so far we've written all of our code to start it inside the main file. So we set up the space, we add a camera, and we get an instance of my camera. We add the camera to my space, and then we start the camera in here. We're actually going to use another class called an app class to contain all of that logic, so that when our main file starts up, we'll just create an app, and then that's it. That's the only thing the main file will do. And all of our code will be in another file called the app class. And that's where it gets really interesting, because that's where you can build an application inside Swift Playgrounds to submit to something like the WWDC 20 challenge. All right, I hope you got that all hooked up and working. If you didn't, go through the video again and have a watch as we kind of type the stuff in, or just read through the instructions. They've actually spelled it out really well here. It's really, these playgrounds are really well written. And shoot us a note at codingathome@thecodehub.ie or live@thecodehub.ie if you don't want to type so much. And we'll see you again tomorrow, where we'll start working on the my app class. All right, bye.